2 men, 300 enemy soldiers, 1 railroad station that had to fall. By every tactical calculation, by every principle taught in training camps and war colleges, the mathematics were impossible. The mission was suicide. Yet on February 9, 1945, in the smoke-choked ruins of Manila, 2 American soldiers would do something that defied every rational assessment of what human beings could survive. This is not a story about superhuman warriors. This is a story about what happens when impossible choices meet unbreakable will, when the only path forward leads through certain death, and when friendship means something more terrible and beautiful than any metal can capture. What you are about to hear is not fiction. Every bullet, every scream, every decision was real, and by the time the smoke cleared, the world would know the names Cleto Rodriguez and John Ree. The air above Manila tasted like cremation, not the clean smoke of wood fires or even the acrid petroleum stench of burning vehicles, but something worse, something that coated the back of the throat and would not wash away no matter how much water a man drank. It was the smell of a city dying in pieces, block by block, building by building, room by room. February 1945, and the Philippine capital was being murdered by the very army that had once occupied it. The Japanese were not retreating, they were destroying. Every structure that could shelter civilians became a fortress. Every street that could move supplies became a killing ground. The Imperial Japanese Marines defending Manila had received no orders to withdraw, no permission to surrender, no hope of reinforcement or rescue. They had been told to hold the city until death, and they were keeping that promise with a completeness that turned urban warfare into urban annihilation. Paco railroad station sat like a concrete crown in the southern district, a pre-war transportation hub now transformed into something from a nightmare. Its thick walls, designed to withstand tropical storms, now bristled with machine gun nests. Its elevated platforms provided perfect firing positions overlooking the approaches. Its warehouses and administrative buildings formed a maze of interlocking defensive positions, where approximately 300 Japanese Marines had prepared to make the American advance pay in blood for every yard gained. They were not garrison troops or re-echelon supply personnel. They were Special Naval Landing Force soldiers, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, trained for amphibious assault and urban combat, men who viewed surrender as a concept more shameful than death itself. And they had turned Paco Station into a fortress that had already devoured 2 American assaults and left dozens of bodies in the rubble-strewn approaches. The men of Company B, 34th Infantry Regiment, lay pinned behind whatever cover they could find, approximately 100 yards from their objective. They had watched friends die in the first assault. They had carried wounded men back through streets swept by interlocking machine gun fire during the second attempt. Now they waited, exhausted and furious and afraid, while officers and non-commissioned officers tried to formulate a plan that would not require writing letters to dozens more families. The problem was simple and unsolvable. Artillery could reduce the station to rubble in an hour, but the civilian population still trapped throughout the district meant that heavy bombardment was forbidden. Air support could obliterate defensive positions, but close air support in urban terrain with friendlies within 100 yards was asking for fratricide. That left infantry assault, straight into prepared positions defended by soldiers who would not retreat and could not be flanked, because every avenue of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. This was not the clean heat of open country or jungle combat. This was urban heat, radiating from broken concrete and shattered masonry, trapped by smoke that hung in the air like fog, thickening with every building that burned. Men crouched behind walls that still held the morning's warmth, their uniforms soaked through with sweat that would not evaporate in the humidity. Canteens emptied fast. Water discipline became a bitter joke when every breath felt like inhaling steam. The wounded cried out in languages both familiar and foreign, because war had mixed American and Filipino casualties into the same desperate lottery of survival. In this landscape of tactical impossibility, two soldiers made a decision that military doctrine would call insane. Private Cleto Rodriguez and Private First Class John Ree did not volunteer for a suicide mission through any formal chain of command. They did not ask permission. They simply stood up when everyone else was pinned down, picked up their Browning automatic rifles, and began moving forward toward an objective that had already killed better men. What makes a human being do this? Not patriotism, not at that moment. Not glory, not when every step forward increases the mathematical probability of death. Not even hatred of the enemy, though that existed. Something else. Something that lives in the space between animal fear and conscious choice. The place where training and fatigue and accumulated rage and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness combine into action that looks like courage from a distance, but feels like falling from the inside. Rodriguez was 24 years old, born in San Marcos, Texas, raised in poverty that made army wages look like wealth. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 140 pounds, and held a Browning automatic rifle like it was part of his skeleton. The bar was not a weapon for small men. 19.5 pounds unloaded, nearly 24 pounds with a full 20-round magazine. It was a support weapon designed to provide automatic fire at the squad level. It kicked like a mule. Its cyclic rate of 550 rounds per minute could empty a magazine in under 3 seconds if a man held the trigger down. It required strength to control, discipline to conserve ammunition, and skill to maintain in combat conditions where dirt and humidity conspired to jam the mechanism. Rodriguez had all three. More importantly, he understood something that separated adequate soldiers from deadly ones. He understood timing. He understood that automatic weapons fire was not about holding the trigger until the magazine emptied. It was about short bursts, controlled fire, making each burst count because ammunition was never infinite, and every wasted round was a future moment when the weapon would be empty and useless. John Ree was older, 29, from Missouri, a private first class who had seen enough combat to know exactly how bad their situation was and chose to move forward anyway. He carried his own bar with the casual competence of a man who had fired thousands of rounds in training and hundreds more in combat where mistakes resulted in death rather than reprimands. The two men were not best friends in the conventional sense. War does not allow for that luxury. They were something both simpler and more profound. They were soldiers who trusted each other's competence absolutely, who had developed the wordless communication that comes from shared danger, who knew that if one man said move, the other would move, and if one man said shoot, the other would already have the target acquired. This was not friendship. This was the bond that forms when survival depends on another person's skill and judgment every single day. They moved separately at first, not together, because movement in urban combat is never synchronized like parade ground drill. Rodriguez went first, using rubble and destroyed vehicles for cover, moving in short rushes while other soldiers provided covering fire. The Japanese position erupted in response. Machine gun fire chewed through wood and brick, sending splinters and stone chips flying in clouds that stung exposed skin. Rifle rounds cracked overhead with that distinctive supersonic snap that means the bullet passed close enough to part your hair. Rodriguez dove behind a destroyed truck chassis, waited 3 heartbeats while the enemy fire shifted, then moved again. Ree followed, using different cover, establishing his own firing position while Rodriguez moved. Leapfrog advancement. Textbook infantry tactics. Except textbooks were written for situations where the enemy eventually suppressed or withdrew. These Japanese Marines were doing neither. 60 yards from Paco station, Rodriguez and Ree found a house. Not an intact house. Not a home where families ate meals and children played. A structure. 4 walls mostly standing. Part of a roof. A doorway that had lost its door. Windows that framed empty air where glass had exploded outward from internal fires. But it was forward of the American lines, angled toward the Japanese position, and it offered something more valuable than comfort. It offered a firing position with concealment and partial cover, close enough to make the bar effective, far enough that they might survive the first few seconds of return fire. They moved inside quickly, clearing the interior with economical movements born from training and necessity. No bodies, no booby traps, just broken furniture and the smell of burned wood and that other smell, the one that never fully went away, the smell of decomposition that permeated every structure in this dying city. Rodriguez moved to one window. Ree took another, 15 feet away. They did not need to discuss fields of fire or sector assignments. Each man knew his responsibility. Together, their bars covered an arc that included the main approaches to the station, the defensive positions visible in the windows and doorways, and the open ground where Japanese reinforcements would have to move if they tried to shift troops to counter an American advance. For perhaps 10 seconds, there was silence except for the distant sound of fighting in other districts, the background noise of Manila's death that had become so constant it was almost soothing, like terrible music played too long. Then Rodriguez opened fire, and the world became chaos. The Browning automatic rifle firing is not a sound that fades into background noise. It is a hammering bark, rapid and brutal, distinct from the lighter crack of rifles or the sustained rattle of belt-fed machine guns. Rodriguez fired in controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, shifting aim between visible targets. A Japanese soldier leaning out from a window, a machine gun crew adjusting their weapons position, a cluster of figures moving between buildings. Each burst was deliberate. Each target was chosen for tactical effect rather than simple opportunity. He was not trying to kill every Japanese soldier in the station. He was trying to disrupt their defensive coordination, to force them to take cover when they should be firing, to create the psychological effect that comes from unexpected fire from an unexpected direction. Ree added his own fire seconds later, his bar barking out its own message of death. The effect was multiplicative. 2 automatic weapons firing from a position the Japanese had not anticipated, from a building they thought was clear, created confusion that was more valuable than casualties in that first minute. The Japanese position lit up like a kicked anthill. Muzzle flashes erupted from dozens of locations. Return fire sleeted toward Rodriguez and Ree's position, chewing through the walls, shattering what remained of the window frames, filling the air with the whine of ricochets and the thud of bullets striking masonry. But the house held. More importantly, the 2 Americans were already moving, shifting positions within the structure, firing from different angles, creating the impression of a larger force. The mathematics of ammunition became brutally relevant almost immediately. Each bar magazine held 20 rounds. Rodriguez had brought as many magazines as he could carry, stuffed into pouches on his web gear, crammed into pockets, every available space converted into ammunition storage because he understood what was going to happen. But even maximum load was finite. At his rate of fire, disciplined and controlled, he was consuming approximately 1 magazine every minute. Ree was firing at a similar pace. They had brought grenades as well, fragmentation grenades designed for exactly this type of close-range work, but grenades were even more limited in supply. Every explosion had to count. The Japanese response evolved from confused to coordinated with terrifying speed. These were not conscripts or hastily trained recruits. They were professionals who understood combined arms and mutual support. Machine gun fire shifted to systematic suppression, sweeping the building in overlapping arcs designed to keep the Americans pinned. Rifle grenades began to impact around the structure, close enough that the concussion waves slapped against the walls. The Japanese were not panicking. They were problem-solving, applying doctrine and training to eliminate a threat. Rodriguez and Ree adapted. When one man fired, the other moved. When suppressive fire forced them away from windows, they used holes in the walls, firing from positions the enemy had not yet learned. They threw grenades, not randomly but at specific targets. A machine gun crew that was becoming too accurate. A cluster of soldiers preparing to rush their position. An officer visible for 3 seconds in a doorway, attempting to coordinate a counterattack. The grenades exploded with flat, brutal cracks, sending shrapnel through wooden walls and flesh with equal indifference. Men screamed. Not Hollywood screams. Real screams, the sounds human beings make when metal tears through their bodies, high-pitched and animal and mercifully brief in most cases. The kill count rose. 10 Japanese dead, 20, 30. These were not numbers Rodriguez and Ree were counting in the moment. Tactical assessment in combat is about effects, not statistics. Is the enemy suppressed? Are reinforcements moving? Is return fire increasing or decreasing? But the effect was observable. Japanese movement between positions slowed. The coordinated counterattack being prepared fell apart when key personnel died. Reinforcements that should have moved up from reserve positions stayed pinned down by fire that seemed impossibly accurate for 2 rifles against 300 defenders. Time became elastic, the way it always does in sustained combat. Seconds stretched into subjective minutes. Rodriguez would later have no precise memory of how long they held that position. 10 minutes, 20. Subjective experience and objective measurement diverged completely. What he would remember was the growing pile of empty magazines at his feet, the heat of the bar's barrel radiating through the ventilated shroud, the way his shoulder ached from the weapon's recoil absorbed through repeated impacts, the metallic taste of adrenaline and fear in his mouth, the smell of burned powder so thick it was difficult to breathe. Ree was methodical, mechanical almost in his fire discipline. Acquire target, short burst, assess, next target. His face showed no expression beyond concentration. This was not movie combat where soldiers shouted epithets or made jokes. This was work. Deadly, exhausting, necessary work. When a magazine emptied, he dropped it, loaded a fresh one, charged the weapon, resumed firing, all with movements so economically efficient they looked choreographed. The bar was not designed for sustained automatic fire. The barrel heated rapidly. Prolonged firing could warp the barrel or cook off rounds remaining in the chamber. Ree understood this. He varied his rate of fire, allowing brief cooling periods, maximizing the weapon's lifespan because their lives depended on it continuing to function. The Japanese adjusted again. Unable to eliminate the threat through direct fire, they began targeting the structure itself. Heavier weapons came into play. A mortar team, carefully positioned to avoid civilian areas, began dropping rounds in the vicinity. The first mortar round impacted 20 yards short, throwing up a fountain of dirt and debris. The second was closer. The third hit the building next door, collapsing part of its remaining wall in a rumble of falling brick and dust. Rodriguez and Ree understood what this meant. The Japanese had their range. The next few rounds would bracket their position. The building would not survive a direct hit, and they would not survive the building's collapse. They had 2 choices: withdraw to friendly lines, abandoning the position they had fought to establish, allowing the Japanese to reoccupy their defensive coordination, or advance closer into the dead space directly below the mortar's minimum elevation, where the weapon could not effectively target them without endangering the station itself. Withdrawal was tactically sound, defensible, reasonable. Advance was insane. They advanced. Moving forward under fire is not a single decision. It is 1,000 micro-decisions, each one potentially fatal. Rodriguez went first, bursting from the building in a running crouch, bar clutched across his chest, legs pumping, lungs burning. The Japanese fire concentrated on him instantly. Rifle rounds kicked up dirt at his feet. Machine gun tracers drew glowing lines through the air, missing by margins measured in inches. He dove behind a collapsed wall section, rolled, came up already searching for Ree. The younger man was moving, using Rodriguez's suppressive fire, zigzagging between pieces of cover too small to hide a child, but which at least broke the clean sight lines that would make him an easy target. They covered another 20 yards in this manner, paying for each yard with sweat and fear and ammunition they could not spare. The new position was worse than the first in every respect except distance. Less cover, more exposed to enfilade fire from multiple directions. But they were closer, and closeness in this context meant their bars became even more effective. At 40 yards, every round that left the barrel had a clean trajectory to target. Aimed fire became almost casual in its precision. A window with muzzle flash, fire, the muzzle flash stopped. A doorway with movement, fire, the movement became stillness. The Japanese kept dying, 50, 60. These numbers would be confirmed later through body counts and battlefield assessment, but in the moment they were visible only as effects. Fewer enemy firing, longer pauses between coordinated bursts, the beginning of disorganization that happens when a defensive position loses enough personnel that the survivors can no longer effectively cover all approaches. Rodriguez and Ree were not winning. Two men cannot defeat 300 through direct combat. But they were creating the conditions for victory, suppressing the enemy to the point where another American assault might succeed where the previous two had failed. Ammunition became the crisis that overshadowed even the enemy fire. Rodriguez fired his last full magazine. He had 3 partial magazines left, rounds taken from dead soldiers' equipment earlier in the day, magazines that might hold 10 rounds or 5 or 2. He could not know until he loaded them and pulled the trigger. Ree was in similar condition. They had brought everything they could carry. They had fired with discipline and care. But sustained automatic weapons fire consumes ammunition at rates that make pre-combat planning look optimistic. The mathematics were simple and brutal. They had perhaps 2 minutes of firing time remaining, less if they needed to suppress a concentrated assault. They looked at each other. No words, none were needed. They had accomplished what they came to do. The Japanese position was disrupted, casualties were severe, and their own lines could now advance with reasonable chance of success. Withdrawal was not cowardice. It was tactical sense. They began to pull back, moving by bounds, one man covering while the other moved, the same drill that had brought them forward now operating in reverse. They made it 15 yards before the Japanese flanking squad appeared. These were not defenders reacting to immediate threat. This was a prepared counterattack, soldiers who had moved through covered routes to appear on Rodriguez and Ree's left flank, a classic tactical response to infiltrators. The Japanese squad numbered approximately 8 men, armed with rifles and light machine guns, and they had done their job perfectly. They had identified the threat, maneuvered into position, and now emerged from cover with clear fields of fire into the Americans' exposed flank. The first burst of machine gun fire caught John Ree across the torso. There are no adequate words for what high-velocity rounds do to the human body at close range. Medical terminology uses phrases like catastrophic tissue damage and unsurvivable wounds, which are accurate and bloodless and completely inadequate to describe the reality. Ree went down hard. his bar falling from suddenly nerveless hands, his body hitting the ground in a way that had no drama, no movie grace. He simply ceased being a standing figure and became a man dying on broken concrete. Rodriguez's response was not thought. It was trained reflex married to something deeper, something that lives in the space between reason and rage. He pivoted, brought the bar to bear, and emptied his remaining ammunition into the Japanese squad in one sustained burst that violated every principle of fire discipline he had learned. The weapon climbed in his hands from recoil, the barrel tracking up and right, but at this range it did not matter. The cone of fire was wide enough. 3 Japanese soldiers fell. The others scrambled for cover, their own fire going wild, the ambush momentum broken by Rodriguez's savage response. The bar's bolt locked back on an empty chamber. Rodriguez dropped the weapon, dove for Ree's rifle, came up with it in hand, fired 3 rounds at visible targets, bought himself seconds. Ree was conscious. His eyes were open. Blood was spreading across his uniform in a way that meant arterial damage, the kind of wound where minutes were optimistic and hours were fantasy. His lips moved. Rodriguez could not hear what he said over the ringing in his ears from sustained fire, but he understood the meaning. Go, leave me, survive. Combat does not allow time for grief. It allows only for reaction. Rodriguez grabbed Ree's bar because leaving functional weapons for the enemy was unthinkable, slung it awkwardly across his back with his own empty rifle, and began moving toward friendly lines in a stumbling run. The Japanese fired after him. Rounds cracked past his head. One tugged at his sleeve without penetrating flesh. Another ricocheted off the ground and struck his boot heel hard enough to throw off his stride. He kept moving because stopping meant dying, and Ree's sacrifice meant nothing if he stopped. The American lines opened up with covering fire, forcing the Japanese to take cover, giving Rodriguez the seconds he needed to cover the final yards and collapse behind friendly positions. Hands grabbed him, pulled him down. Voices shouted questions he could not process. His hearing was damaged from sustained exposure to unsuppressed fire. His body was running on adrenaline that would crash within minutes. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely release his grip on Ree's bar. Behind him, John Ree died alone on broken ground between the lines. The Japanese did not recover his body. The Americans could not. He lay there while the battle continued, while Rodriguez gave his gasping report to officers who listened with expressions that mixed horror and calculation, while artillery was finally called in because the civilian situation had changed or the tactical calculus had shifted, while Company B launched its 3rd assault on Paco Station. And this time, they broke through the Japanese lines and captured the objective that 2 men had made vulnerable. The body count would later confirm approximately 82 Japanese casualties directly attributed to Rodriguez and Ree's action. This number would be disputed, refined, argued over by historians and military analysts for decades. The precise number did not matter to Rodriguez. What mattered was that John Ree had died to cover a withdrawal that allowed Rodriguez to survive. And that survival came with a weight that no metal could balance. Paco Railroad Station fell on February 9, 1945. The battle for Manila continued for another 3 weeks, destroying 80% of the city and killing 100,000 civilians in what would become known as one of the worst urban battles of World War II. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, forcing American troops to fight building by building, room by room, in combat so close that opposing soldiers sometimes fought hand-to-hand in stairwells too narrow for rifles. The city burned. Entire districts became graveyards. The civilian population, caught between 2 armies in a battle that recognized no neutrality, died in numbers that made military casualties look almost modest by comparison. Cleto Rodriguez survived the battle. He survived the war. He returned to Texas, carried John Ree's memory with him, and lived another 64 years before dying at the age of 89. The Medal of Honor citation would describe his actions in language carefully crafted to capture tactical detail, while somehow conveying the sheer impossibility of what he and Ree accomplished. Congressional medals are written by committee, vetted by lawyers, designed to meet specific documentary standards. They are not good at conveying what it feels like to make the choice Rodriguez made, to walk forward into that fire, to leave a friend dying because survival demanded it. John Ree's Medal of Honor came posthumously, delivered to his family in Missouri with condolences from a grateful nation, and no adequate explanation for why gratitude felt so empty when measured against loss. His body was eventually recovered after the battle, identified through dental records and service tags, and buried with honors. But he died on the ground, alone, in the seconds or minutes between Rodriguez's withdrawal and the moment when consciousness finally failed. What thoughts occupied those final moments? What fears or regrets or simple animal awareness of approaching death? No citation could capture and no history could record. The story of Paco Railroad Station became a footnote in the larger Battle of Manila, itself a chapter in the Philippine Campaign, itself a component of the Pacific War, itself a theater in World War II. The specific becomes the general through historical process. The names blur, the details fade. What remains is the mathematical obscenity of the original equation. 2 men, 300 enemy soldiers. And somehow, impossibly, the 2 men created conditions for victory through will and violence and sacrifice that defied every reasonable prediction of outcome. But this was not a miracle. Miracles suggest divine intervention, something beyond human agency. What Rodriguez and Ree accomplished was entirely human, which makes it both more terrible and more beautiful. They were not superhuman. They were soldiers who made choices, who trained their skills until those skills became reflexive, who understood their weapons and terrain and the enemy's capabilities, who were lucky in the moments when luck mattered and skilled in the moments when skill was enough, and who paid the price that war demands from those who fight at the sharp edge where tactics meet human flesh. The questions that remain are not historical. The historical record is clear. The questions are moral and philosophical and deeply personal. What creates the kind of bond that makes a man charge forward when rational calculation says only death waits ahead? What internal calculus allows someone to keep fighting when every sensory input screams for withdrawal? What does it cost to survive when survival requires leaving someone behind? And what does courage actually mean when stripped of rhetoric and examined in the cold light of consequences? Rodriguez would be asked these questions in various forms for the rest of his life. Interviews, ceremonies, school visits where children asked bright, terrible questions about war with the casual cruelty of those who have never experienced violence. He answered with the economy of someone who understood that words were inadequate. He and Ree had done what needed doing. They had trained for it, prepared for it, and when the moment came, they did not hesitate because hesitation meant death for more than just themselves. Was it courage? Was it duty? Was it simply the accumulated momentum of training and circumstance and personality that combined to produce action? Perhaps the most honest answer is that it was human. Entirely, completely, terribly human. The capacity for both extraordinary violence and extraordinary sacrifice, the ability to kill efficiently while dying for others, the strange mathematics where 2 lives risked can save dozens more. These are not aberrations. They are possibilities that exist within the species, demonstrated throughout history in circumstances that reveal what people are capable of when pushed beyond normal limits of fear and endurance. The medals sit in museums now. The citations are read by historians. The tactical analysis is studied by military professionals. But the moment itself, those minutes on February 9th, 1945, when 2 soldiers made every bullet count and paid the price that math demanded, that moment exists outside of analysis. It exists in the realm of lived experience that cannot be fully translated into language, only approximated through narrative that tries and fails and tries again to capture what it means to face impossible odds and act anyway. This is why we remember, not because war is glorious, not because violence solved anything permanent or created anything lasting. We remember because Rodriguez and Ree were real, their actions were real, their fear and courage and friendship and death were real, and that reality deserves acknowledgement. They were not saints. They were not monsters. They were soldiers in a war that killed millions, a war that destroyed a city around them, a war that demanded everything from those who fought it and gave nothing back except survival for some and memory for all. The railroad station still stands in Manila, rebuilt after the war, repurposed for civilian use, hosting commuters and tourists who walk through its halls without knowing that 80 years ago, 2 American soldiers held a position 60 yards from its walls and changed the mathematics of what 2 people can accomplish against impossible odds. There are no plaques, no monuments. The ground where John Ree died has been paved over decades ago. The houses where they fired from have been demolished and rebuilt multiple times. The physical evidence of that day has been erased by time and reconstruction, and the normal process of cities healing from wounds that once seemed permanent. But the story remains, and stories properly told, properly remembered, carry weight that monuments cannot match. They force us to confront questions we would rather avoid. What would we do in that situation? Would we have the courage to stand when every instinct screamed to run? Would we have the discipline to make every shot count when panic was reasonable and composure was insane? Would we be capable of the choice Rodriguez made, to leave a friend dying because staying meant both would die? These are not comfortable questions. They should not be. War is not comfortable. Sacrifice is not comfortable. The truth about human capacity for both destruction and heroism is not comfortable. But comfort is not the point. Understanding is the point. Recognition is the point. Acknowledgement that these events happened, these choices were made, these prices were paid, and we who live in the aftermath have some obligation to remember accurately, without romance and without cynicism, the real cost of the world we inherited. If you have watched this far, if you have stayed with this story through its darkness and its weight, and its refusal to provide easy answers, then you understand something important. You understand that history is not about dates and battles and casualty figures. History is about individual human beings making choices under pressure that would break most people, about moments when the impossible became the necessary, about the price that some people pay so that others might live. I would ask you to do something. Not because it helps me, though subscription and engagement do matter to creators, but because stories like this deserve to be shared. If this narrative meant something to you, if it made you think or feel or reconsider your understanding of courage and sacrifice, then share it. Subscribe to this channel so that more stories like this, stories that resist simplification and demand engagement, can continue to be told. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Not about whether war is good or bad, because that is a tired debate. But about this: if you were in Rodriguez's position, making that choice to withdraw and leave Ree behind, knowing it was tactically correct but morally devastating, could you have done it? And if you could, what would that choice have cost you for the rest of your life? This is not a rhetorical question. This is an invitation to genuine reflection. The story of Paco Railroad Station is not just history, it is a mirror. What it reflects depends on who looks into it and what they are willing to see. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that some stories, the ones that matter most, are the ones that refuse to provide comfort or closure or simple lessons, but instead demand that we sit with complexity and honor the people who lived it.